If someone were to ask you, why are you Christian? What would you tell them? Maybe for some of you, we would say that, you were raised Christian and it's just kind of what your family's always done. And so it always made sense to you. And for others, maybe if you spend a long enough time in Lafayette, you just realize it's probably the thing to do around here because it's just kind of part of our culture. And it's culturally advantageous to be Christian rather than to not be Christian. Of course, maybe some of you, hopefully more of you, have had more of a personal experience with Jesus, maybe in prayer, maybe on some kind of retreat or conference. And through that personal experience, you realize God is real and Jesus is Lord and he loves you. And because of that, you've decided to devote your life to this religion. Maybe some of you simply realize that you're overall generally a better human being when you're Christian as opposed to when you're not. Maybe some of you even tried not being Christian for a little while, or at least being Christian in name only, but by actions, you weren't very Christian, and you've lived that life and you've realized that, yeah, it wasn't helping your marriage, it wasn't helping your social life, it wasn't helping your general civic duties. And so maybe you've just realized, you know what, in order to be a decent human being, I need to be following the teachings of Jesus. And don't get me wrong, all of these are good reasons. They're not bad reasons. It's better to be Christian for literally any reason than to not be Christian. But what if some of these reasons start to become a little fragile? What if because of certain life situations, the reasons start to fall apart a bit? Like what if, it becomes a little bit inconvenient to be Christian? And maybe socially, your friends kind of stop caring about that thing. Maybe they start acting in ways that are opposed to Christianity, and so it's a little bit more difficult. What if prayer becomes dry or difficult? What if you start to have doubts? What if you start to suffer? What if people that you love start to die? And there's all these questions that come into your head. What if you meet some amazing people that are not Christian? And you wonder to yourself, well, if they're so amazing and they're not Christian, well, then I wonder what makes us that different. So all of these reasons that we have sometimes can become a little wobbly, become a little fragile whenever life starts to unfold. And maybe you can relate to kind of questioning your faith at times, whether or not this is all really worth it or worth your time. But today, on Easter Sunday, we proclaim a message loud and clear. We make a bold statement. It's such a bold statement that if we really took a moment to think about what we're saying, it's rather controversial because it's challenging and it demands that if we're going to say it or even listen to it, we need to make a decision about whether or not it's true. Our statement that we make is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And this is it. This is the foundation of our faith. Yes, we believe in a lot. There's a lot of teachings of Jesus that are lived out through his bride, the church. But all of those boil down to one event that happened 2,000 years ago in history. It really happened that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And we have historical evidence, concrete data that is historically reliable to support this claim. But even if we have all this evidence, just as with anything that's happened in history, there is a level of faith that it takes for us to believe history, for us to believe those who have passed down the history to us. And therefore, you and I, all of us have a decision to make today. And the question is whether or not it's true that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. So what I'd like to do today is give you a few reasons why I believe it's true. Reasons why we as Christians can base our faith not simply on personal experience, not simply on the benefits received, but rather basing it on historical data, on a real event that took place. So here are just a few reasons. First, we have to go to the reliability of Scripture. It's so easy and tempting to just dismiss Scripture as just some kind of fairy tale because it's old or because, I don't know why, because people just like to do that. But the reality is, as an ancient source document, it doesn't compare to any other ancient sources. It's far greater in its reliability. For example, typically with ancient writings that are speaking about historical events, usually by the time it's written down and preserved for history, it's usually a couple of hundred years after the event took place. That's kind of commonplace for ancient writings because usually people would talk about it and pass it down orally. And finally, when they would realize that they're still talking about it hundreds of years later, they write it down to preserve it for generations to come. Not so for the Gospels. The gospel writers wrote during the lifetime of the apostles, 30 or 40 years after the events of Jesus took place. That's dramatically closer in time span to the unfolding of history. Second, there's more manuscripts of the Gospels than any other ancient writing. Thousands more. Usually there's just a few here and there for any other ancient source of history. But for the Gospels, there's a ton. And they all have a striking resemblance to all the details, signifying that there must be something here. There's too much agreement across multiple sources. And fourth, or third, I can't remember, whatever number I'm on. The next thing, I have a lot of numbers, so just buckle up. All right, here's the next thing. So James, Matthew, oh gosh, now I'm distracted. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, gospel writers. Okay, so think about this for a second. Matthew and John, they're apostles. That makes sense that they would write a story about their time with Christ. That seems very convincing, right? And it's true, and it is convincing. But have you ever thought, like, who the heck is Mark and Luke? Like, why? Like, think about it. If you're going to fabricate some kind of story, why would you say that the author is someone that no one's ever heard of? Mark and Luke. Of course, these are important figures. We know that Mark was a disciple of Peter and Luke was a disciple of Paul. But if they wanted to fabricate a story, the best thing would have been for them to say, this is the gospel of Peter and the gospel of Paul. That's the famous guys. Here's the credibility, the historical convincing factor. But they didn't do that because they weren't interested in fabricating a story in order to get more people convinced. They were simply proclaiming what they knew to be true. And they really were the authors, Mark and Luke. So they just said what was true. So there's a lot more we could say about the reliability of scriptures and the gospels, but it's a homily, so we got to keep moving. So the next thing is looking at what scripture actually says. There is an empty tomb. If you think about the context, that is politically dangerous for both the Jews and the Romans. It was in both of the Jewish and Roman authorities' interests to find the body of Jesus so that they could disprove this way of the Christian movement. But they couldn't. There was no body ever produced. To this day, we do not have the bones of Jesus to venerate as relics. The body is missing. The tomb is empty. And after the empty tomb is discovered, Jesus, the risen Jesus, begins to appear. to a number of different people, to a couple of individuals like Mary Magdalene and Peter and John, to groups of people like the apostles in the upper room, and even a large crowd, as St. Paul references in his first letter to the Corinthians. So there's a bunch of multiple occasions where the risen Jesus reveals himself to people, and they see him in the flesh after he truly died. It wasn't just one person, it wasn't just two people, it was a number of eyewitness accounts. Now, similar to the Mark and Luke example, some of these eyewitnesses were women. Now, before you get all upset, we love women these days, 2026. Women are wonderful, they're talented, they're amazing. But back in the first century, they didn't know that quite yet, all right? And in the first century, there wasn't a whole lot of historical reliability upon the eyewitness of women. If they wanted something persuasive and historically reliable, if they wanted something that held weight and authority, it needed to become from the eyewitness of men. So why in the world, within that context, would the Christians claim that the first person to see the risen Jesus was Mary Magdalene? That would not be very convincing. If you're trying to start a world religion from scratch, that would be a bad move. But again, they're not trying to fabricate something in order for people to drink Kool-Aid. They're here to simply proclaim what happened, what's historically accurate, what's true. And God in his providence showed us the dignity of woman by appearing first to Mary of Magdala. And perhaps the most convincing factor is the witness of the apostles. Think about how all of the apostles, except John, abandoned Christ. They were totally cowards. They were afraid. After spending 3 years with him and learning his teachings and proclaiming their loyalty to him, they totally crumbled whenever it got real. Whenever Jesus started to suffer, whenever he got arrested, whenever they beat him, whenever they put him on the road to Calvary to be crucified, the apostles scattered and they hid and they were afraid because they did not want to be associated with Jesus, because they knew that their life was at risk, that they would probably too be crucified. So what do? They're hiding. And then all of a sudden, is it just a coincidence that at the same exact moment, all of them would all of a sudden do a 180 shift and be the most boldly courageous people in the entire world, proclaiming a unified message that Jesus Christ is risen? And it's one thing if they planned ahead of time to make that 180 shift, but if it was all fabricated, surely at least one of them would have cracked under pressure. But all of them died as martyrs, and many more did. Thousands of martyrs in the early church died for this truth because they weren't interested in fabricating a religion for centuries later that they wouldn't even be a part of. They were simply convicted by what they knew to be true. So again, there are more reasons, but for the sake of homiletics, we'll keep it at that there is a ton of historical data to support that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. But although we've all considered our personal reasons for being Christian, perhaps the more important question is it true? Did he rise or did he not? Because the answer to that question changes everything. If he did not rise from the dead, then Jesus was just another voice in the long line of history. He was just another teacher. Impressive as he was, just another person that lived and died. And his teachings, as good as they are, we can kind of pick and choose and, follow them whenever it's convenient. But really, there's no point in being here and doing what we call worship There's no reason for you to dress up and wake up early every Sunday and come to Mass. There's really no reason to even be a part of this church, or any church by that matter, because Jesus is just another person like Alexander the Great, or George Washington, or Winston Churchill, or some other, Gandhi, Muhammad, just some other person that lived. But if he rose from the dead, that changes everything. We need to take that seriously, because I don't know about you, but I have not risen from the dead yet. And it's not that easy. In fact, I haven't really seen anyone effectively do that on their own. Of course, Jesus rose a few people on his own. But if he rose from the dead, now we have to listen to him. Okay, so then what was he saying? And he was saying, I am. In other words, the name of God. I am who am. I'm the one who is. The tetragrammaton, the word that is too holy to even be said. Jesus revealed himself as God. If Jesus rose from the dead, then there must be more than what meets the eye. If Jesus rose from the dead, then there's something far greater than my life that I'm a part of. And that this whole world is temporary. And that the powers that be, the ones who hold the power and the influence and the authority of this world, that perhaps dominate and abuse that power, it's all just temporary. And it gives us so much hope, because if Jesus rose from the dead, then my life means something. If Jesus rose from the dead, then even whenever times get tough, Christ rose. Like when my spouse is upset with me, Christ rose from the dead. And whenever there's other family drama that seems unsolvable, Christ rose from the dead. And whenever your loved one gets a life-threatening illness, as difficult as that is, Christ rose from the dead. There's something greater here. When I have doubts, when I'm discouraged, when I sin and I wonder if I even have what it takes to live this life, Christ rose from the dead. It changes everything. We should see everything through that lens. Either he rose or he didn't. If he rose, it changes everything. And as we boldly celebrate Easter Sunday today, it's time for each of us to make a decision. Do you believe that Christ rose from the dead? Or do you not? Because I'll tell you, cultural Christianity is not going to be enough for much longer. In the way that the culture is shifting, at least in America, even here in Lafayette, it's going to become more and more inconvenient to be Christian, especially to be Catholic. But if we hold true to historical data and combine that with all of our other personal reasons, maybe we'll have enough to remain faithful. It's time for us to no longer be lukewarm, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. We're either in or we're out. Jesus Christ either rose from the dead or he didn't. You decide. Hey guys, thanks again for listening to our podcast. Don't forget to click the links below to learn more about our mission. Thanks.